am your host, G.I. Wingnut. Welcome back to the channel. Today, in this episode, we are continuing with Satan's Little Season, or more accurately, are we living in Satan's Little Season? Today, I'm going to be taking on what they were talking about in reference to 1800s asylums and orphanages and orphan trains. That stuff happened. But I'm going to explain using history what really happened. But first off, let's take a look at this quick little peek. It's only a couple of minutes long, and then I will get it untangled for you.
And here's what's interesting, um, guys. This is what got me to really thinking this may be true. This is a real possibility. Okay, so back in the early 1800s, there are, and you guys can research this. You can go find all this stuff out for yourself. There were massive insane asylums. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
everywhere, not just in the United States, all over the world, all over this flat level plane that we live on. There were huge insane asylums, and they were filled with people that supposedly, for no reason, just out of the blue, went insane. I mean, millions and millions of people were put into these asylums, and I think a lot of them were held there until they were eventually killed or until they died. Um, and there were millions of orphans that just came out of nowhere getting off these trains. You can see photos and all kinds of evidence of this as well if you research it. Where did all these orphans come from? Why were they stripped from their parents? Where did their parents go? My theory is these people, some of these people refuse to forget the past. Okay, they were fed a false narrative. The government, the rulers of this world, were trying to reprogram the minds of everyone living on Earth at the time. So I believe whoever refused to go along with the new narrative and the new fake history, so to speak, was arrested and placed in these insane asylums and brainwashed and reprogrammed. And I think if the programming took and they were willing to go ahead and go along with the lie, maybe they were released back into society. If not, they were held indefinitely. And I think that's where all the orphans came from. They were literally stripped away from the parents who refused to go along with the narrative.
As I stated at the beginning of this episode, we're going to be talking about orphan trains and asylums. And I'm not exactly sure which way to go with this first, so we'll probably just go ahead and start with the orphan trains. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the orphan trains, and there is just so much to unpack just off of that couple of minutes worth of video from those guys. Anyway, so in reference to the orphan trains, which were known to function between 1854 and 1929. Between 1854 and 1929, the United States was engaged in an ambitious and ultimately controversial social experiment to rescue poor and homeless children, the Orphan Train movement. The orphan trains operated prior to the federal government's involvement in child protection and child welfare. While they operated, orphan trains moved approximately 200,000 children from cities like New York and Boston to the American West to be adopted. Many of these children were placed with parents who loved and cared for them. However, others felt out of place and some were mistreated. So I'm not going to dive into this too deep simply because of the fact that I'm trying to compress the time here. But you know, from what I understand, there's an old adage: the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and they were trying to get the children off the streets because poverty was everywhere, and the riders on the trains got to leave their pasts behind. That's where I got this photograph. Uh, and there was this caused the government to get involved in intervening on behalf of the children. Now let's go ahead and move on into the asylums thing, and then I'm going to come back and revisit this orphan trains thing topic because there's a whole lot of history that also goes into that when it comes to orphan trains coming from the West to the Midwest. So let's take a quick look at Victorian mental asylums, which became a big thing in the United States in the 1800s. It was originally meant to be like a resort, a place to go and recover, kind of a vacation place. And this is where the mineral springs caught on, and oxygen rich environments and that sort of thing for recuperation. It started in England. The Victorian Mental Asylum has the reputation of a place of misery where inmates were locked up and left to the mercy of their keepers, which was often a bad deal. But when the first large asylums were built in the early 1800s, they were part of a new, more humane attitude towards mental health care. The Middlesex County Lunatic Asylum in Hanwell, on the outskirts of London, was one of the first of the new state asylums, and it set many of the standards for mental health care in the Victorian age, which was still rather primitive. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of the weeds on that. I can dive into it another time. But physical restraints were often used, usually for individuals that displayed antisocial behavior. Um, Things like not being able to keep their clothes on. And as you can see there, exhibiting lewd or base physical behavior, unchecked base physical behavior. So promiscuity, chronic self-pleasuring, that sort of thing. Restraints stopped patients harming themselves or attempting to commit suicide. That's a practice that's still used today in closed facilities. With limited application. Occasionally, chemical restraints like Thorazine are employed, depending upon how violent the patient is. Just speaking from personal observations. Patients were frequently strapped into their beds at night to stop them from hurting themselves. Still, that's still a practice, and that can also be seen in long-term care facilities for residents that are known to wander in the middle of the night, not stay in bed, or maybe not be ambulatory but are still able to get out of bed, or maybe even crawl over their side rails and fall and hurt themselves. So restraints, when used properly, can be beneficial for the safety of the patient or resident. And in some of these locked facilities, patients are more often, especially in the long term facilities, more often referred to as residents. And then the last bullet point on this list: some patients were so worried they would hurt themselves that they asked to be restrained, and that's still something that is sometimes expressed these days in modern times, 2024. Physical restraints have fortunately come a long ways since the back in the day. You'll notice this picture over here of the individual restrained in a chair. That's still a technique that's used today. That's even employed in some of those conversion therapy situations, as well as mental health care facilities, high demand troubled teen facilities will employ that sort of technique as a punishment. That's and then minus the restraints on the arms, but there's still mental restraints. That technique is utilized by Scientology during brainwashing sessions. Just side points, just side points. So, changing attitudes to mental health care. Mental illness was recognized as something that might be cured or at least alleviated. We've come a long way since the 1800s, thank goodness. Bullet point number 2. It was no longer acceptable to keep poor mentally ill people in workhouses and prisons. So state provision of asylums became mandatory, and they weren't really any more humane than the prison system in a lot of cases. Last bullet point there. There was unprecedented program of building asylums based on the latest scientific and medical knowledge about mental illness, which again, thank goodness, has come a long way since the 19th century. Moral treatment system, they tried to make things better. And therapeutic employment, again, that kind of goes back to the workhouses and the prison systems. But anymore, therapeutic employment might, like through the VA, includes helping individuals that are going through mental health care treatment and therapy and progressing, are provided with an opportunity to learn a skill within the VA hospital system where they can find employment elsewhere as they're going through their therapy, be it drug and or alcohol treatment or mental health care, whatever the case may be. So there are some benefits to it. And again, thank goodness we've come a long way since 1843. Let's see, non-restraint system. I got to dive into that. The decline of asylums, where they went from a recovery resort that led to the rehabilitation and recovery systems that are quite often seen today, which tend to be rather abusive. Primary example I'm going to give there is the Scientology program known as Narconon. So, on this note, before I go any further, I want to address a real quick clip from Donald J. Trump on his ideas of how to deal with the homeless and getting them off the streets since this whole thing right here was designed trying to get children off the streets. So just for memory rattles and some brief commentary, hopefully lightening it up with some clips from one of my favorite classic dystopian movies. So then we can get on into the rest of the untangling stuff.
Our once great cities have become unlivable, unsanitary nightmares, surrendered to the homeless, the drug addicted, and the violent and dangerously deranged.
This is the police. This is the police. I'm asking you to disperse.
We're making many suffer for the whims of a deeply unwell few, and they are unwell indeed. The homeless have no right to turn every park and sidewalk into a place for them to squat and do drugs. Americans should not have to step over piles of needles and waste as they walk down a street, a beautiful city, or at least once beautiful city, because they've changed so much over the last 10 years. Our first consideration should be the rights and safety of the hardworking, law-abiding citizens who make our society function. When I'm back in the White House, we will use every tool, lever, and authority to get the homeless off our streets. We want to take care of them, but they have to be off our streets.
The scoops are on their way.
There's nothing compassionate about letting these individuals live in filth and squalor rather than getting them the help that they need. We need professionals to help them. For a small fraction of what we spend upon Ukraine, we could take care of every homeless veteran in America. Our veterans are being treated horribly. Likewise, with all of the money we will save by ending mass unskilled migration, we will have a huge dividend to address this crisis in our own country. Under my strategy, working with states, we will ban urban camping. wherever possible. Violators of these bans will be arrested, but they will be given the option to accept treatment and services if they're willing to be rehabilitated. Many of them don't want that. We'll give them the option. We will then open up large parcels of inexpensive land, bring in doctors, psychiatrists, social workers, and drug rehab specialists, and create 10 cities where the homeless can be relocated and their problems identified. But we'll open up our cities again, make them livable, and make them beautiful. For those who are just temporarily down on their luck, we will work to help them quickly reintegrate into a normal life. For those who have addictions, substance abuse, and common mental health problems, we will get them into treatment. And for those who are severely mentally ill and deeply disturbed, we will bring them back to mental institutions where they belong, with the goal of reintegrating them back into society once they are well enough to manage. It's a tough task, a very tough task. What's taken place on the streets, what's taken place with their taking so much drugs. But the fact is, we're going to try. This strategy will be far better and also far less expensive than spending vast sums of taxpayer money to house the homeless in luxury hotels without addressing their underlying issues. And they have so many of these underlying issues and needs. This is how I will end the scourge of homelessness and make our cities clean and safe and beautiful once again. We will do it. We will bring back America. Thank you.
So let's talk about asylums for a moment. Asylum tourism, according to the American Psychological Association, in the 19th century, travelers visited asylums to admire the institution's architecture and the grounds, alongside mentions of monuments, churches, and historical sites. A 19th century tourist in New York might have found this recommendation in his or her guidebook. Visit the Bloomingdale Asylum for the Insane in Morningside Heights neighborhood of Manhattan, on the grounds of what is now Columbia University. So I tried to follow the link to Morningside Heights. It's gone. It's dead link. But when I followed the link for the Columbia University, I came up with Miller's Stranger's Guide of New York, or of the city of New York, with map. I didn't really dig into it, but the fire insurance company of the city of New York, Hanover, has a rather fancy building. And there's not a whole lot there. That's a pretty fancy billiard table, billiard table. Looks like the Portage, maybe. And this book was published in 1872. I kind of flipped through it, didn't really see any pictures of anything to note, really. I might have to do something on this book later, at another time. But let's go back to the asylum tourism. Quote, "The approach to the asylum from the southern entrance is highly pleasing," reads the 1880 guide, Miller's New York as Is. Oh, maybe that's the book that I was just looking at. The author continues, quote, "The sudden opening of the view, the extent of the grounds, the various avenues gracefully winding through so large a lawn, the central building, is always open to visitors, the view from the top of it being the most extensive and beautiful of any in the vicinity of the city, is well worthy of their attention," end quote. Miller, 1880, pages 46 and 47. Recommending a visit to a mental hospital might seem surprising to modern readers, but this was not unusual at the time. In fact, the asylum tourism of the late 1800s was less voyeuristic than its earlier incarnations. The patients, sometimes including the powerless wives of jealous or bored aristocrats, had often been treated like animals, housed in institutions that were little more than human zoos. It only cost a shilling to see, quote, "the beasts," end quote, rave at Bedlam, as the Bethel Royal Hospital in London, England, was then known. Following the rise of the 19th century of, quote, moral treatment, end quote, insanity came increasingly to be recognized as a curable disease. It was argued that because this disease was caused by draining away of one's mental energy, the mentally ill, quote unquote, as the insane, quote unquote, ultimately came to be called, needed only few things to recover: rest, meaningful employment, appropriate amusements, hygienic conditions, and kindness. New asylums for treating insanity were therefore built for that purpose. Every element of the buildings, both inside and out, was considered an integral part of the treatment. See Yanni, 2007. That's a whole lot different than institutional green or institutional beige, like is so common these days and has been since the 70s. The whole thing about rest, meaningful employment, appropriate amusements, hygienic conditions, and kindness. That sounds an awful lot like the storyline behind Brave New World. Anyway, I'm digressing. The shift in treatment. The new philosophy, cure rather than incarcerate, spread quickly. Throughout the 1800s, institutions opened in large numbers across the Western world, and with this change also came a change in tourism, a shift from viewing the insane to viewing their asylums. So, these buildings were purpose built by modern people. There's historical record of this. These buildings were not discovered. All right, so I'm gonna move on to the next couple of points that I need to bring to the table, and a few other examples to kind of reinforce what I'm trying to put across. Now let's start looking into some of the reasons that may have caused there to be so many orphans that needed to be have homes found for them. So let's looking at some key events during westward expansion. The concept of American expansion. American expansion occurred mainly in the 1800s, was when the United States grew its borders and influence, fueled by the idea of manifest destiny. God said this is our land. Kind of some of that British Israelism nonsense mixed in. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, you can check with Laura over there at Magical Mystery Church, or check in with John Collins at Leaving the Message. Anyway, moving on. Fueled by the idea of the manifest destiny, Americans believed it was their fate to spread from the East Coast to the West Coast. It caused big changes, like Native Americans losing their homes, conflicts with other countries, and the U.S. changing into an industrialized nation. Things like the Transcontinental Railroad also helped fulfill the manifest destiny of America. America also added places outside the main part of the country, such as Alaska and Hawaii, and set up colonies in the Pacific, but more on that later. So let's kind of peruse through here. Territorial expansion and economic growth. There was a whole lot of buffalo that were killed, and that was the primary food source for the indigenous peoples, the First Nations that were being pushed further and further westward. Let's see, shaping the American identity, the idea of manifest destiny, which is basically the belief that God was meant to spread across the whole or that America, sorry, that the belief that America was meant to spread across the whole continent was a big deal during this time. It not only gave a reason for taking over the land, but also shaped how Americans saw themselves. They thought they had a special mission to bring democracy and civilization as they moved west. And this idea became a big part of what it means to be American. Dispersion of Native Americans. Well, that started in the colonial period, was further amplified by President Andy Jackson with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which created the Trail of Tears, which also gave America the reservations in a lot of parts that we recognize. Um, the Indian Removal Act and all the treaties that went with that were formed under the War Department, which during the Reconstruction period in the 1870s became a thing of the past and became then known as the Department of Defense, which meant rather than the treaties being transferred from the War Department to the Department of Defense, which makes sense to me, it was shifted to the Department of Interior, which means Native American Indian reservations, as they're called in modern society, are managed by the same people that manage national forests. So it's really not a big stretch for me that somebody would suggest building other encampments, cattle ranches, reservations, or whatever on lands that are managed by the same organization for, oh, I don't know, treatment of the mentally ill, homeless. Anyway, moving along, Transnational Railroad was a big thing for that. That whole industrial revolution and everything, there was a whole lot that played off of that, including the American Civil War, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Early motivations for expansion. Economic opportunities. Greed, 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 greed. Land acquisition and agriculture, because, yeah, God said it's ours. Trade routes and commerce. The creation of massive trade routes played an important part in westward expansion. The Oregon Trail spanned over 2,000 miles. Yeah, a lot of people died on the Oregon Trail. There's a video game about it from back in the day. Most people died of dysentery. And quite often in those times, adults would sacrifice themselves to save their children. Ask the Mormons about that. I'll have to do a whole thing about the Meadow Mountains Massacre, or you can check out what Nuance Ho did on YouTube about the Meadow Mountains Massacre. Crazy stuff. Crazy stuff. Anyway, moving along. Number 2, Manifest Destiny ideology. The ideology, Manifest Destiny, a pivotal driver of westward expansion, stemmed from the strong belief in America's destined expansion from one coast to another. Emerging prominently in the 19th century, this concept shaped the nation's identity and influenced its territorial aspirations. Number 2, or B, rather, cultural and religious motivations. Westward expansion was equally propelled by cultural and religious incentives, resulting in a rich tapestry of diverse influences in the American landscape, which we can blatantly see today. We can blatantly see that today, which is part of the reason why we're on this dive. So, important events of westward expansion. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the Lewis and Clark Expedition in 1804 to 1806, Oregon Trail opening in the early 1840s, annexation of Texas in 1845, the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, California Gold Rush, 1848 to 1855, Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, Bleeding Kansas, 1854 to 1861. That would be leading up to the Civil War and the border wars between Kansas and Missouri. There was the Pony Express, 1860-1861. The Homestead Act, 1862, which gives us the Sooner history from Oklahoma, when some folks would go and stake their claims sooner than others because They had family on the starting line, and they got out there sooner than the others did because they were already out there. Anyway, the Transcontinental Railroad completion in 1869 and closing of the frontier in 1890. I'm not going to go into the breakdown on all of those. Other things that were affecting westward expansion, like I mentioned, there was disease, there was health, depopulation of the Indians. Disease took its greatest toll on Native Americans. That can be seen with the blankets that were given with the smallpox in them. 1801, 1802. It says here, no other disease ravaged Indian peoples more than the dreaded smallpox. Fortunately, that has a simple preventative measure now. This, let's see, the major pandemic in the 19th century West occurred in 1801, 1802 among tribes in the central and northwestern regions of the continent. This epidemic devastated people along the Missouri River with particular ferocity. Between 1836 and 1840, another epidemic swept the northern plains, killing many, including thousands of Blackfeet, Pawnees, and Mandans. Cholera was another big issue in the West. Not going to get into all that. There's sources on it. And one more thing on the orphans. Orphans in the 1880s, adopted or enslaved. This is coming from the College Savings Club of America. Wanted, Homes for Children. A company of homeless children from the East will arrive at Troy, Missouri on Friday, February 25th, 1910. So, opening paragraph here. The Orphan Train movement, a sweeping attempt to protect homeless, poor, and orphaned children in a time before social welfare or foster care. Organized by reformers in the eastern United States, the program swept children westward in an attempt to both remove them from the squalor and poverty of the city and help provide labor for farms out west. Between 1854 and 1929, about 200,000 children were placed on the trains and adopted by new families. But though many children did ride to better lives on orphan trains, others did not. So enough on that for the moment. I've got two more tabs I want to touch on just to make sure I've got the point across. So let's talk about the American Indian Wars timeline. And I'm particularly interested in the 19th century, the 1800s. So let's go ahead and jump all the way down the list. And we're going to start with the Battle of Tippecanoe, the War of 1812. The Battle of Tippecanoe happened November 7th, 1811. Then there's the War of 1812. Battle of Horseshoe Bend, March 27th, 1814. First Seminole War, 1816 to 1818. Arikara War, June 2nd, 1823. Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842. Third Seminole War, 1855 to 1858. The Black Hawk War, April to August 1832. Comanche War of 1840. Sand Creek Massacre, Battle of Little Bighorn. Sand Creek Massacre, November 29th, 1864. Red Cloud's War. Red Cloud's War, 1866 to 1867. Battle of Little Bighorn, June 25th, 26th, 1876. Red River War, 1874 to 1875. Wounded Knee Massacre, December 29th, 1890. There's another thing that I'm wanting to touch on real quick. Let me pull that tab up. Actually, I fibbed. It's 3 tabs. So I got the American Indian Urban Relocation Program. The U.S. government's efforts to assimilate American Indians into mainstream culture can be seen through the 20th century in the Bureau of Indian Affairs activities. In 1953, U.S. Congress established a new policy towards American Indians, termination. This policy eliminated much government support for Indian tribes and ended the protected trust status of all Indian-owned lands, which, by the way, currently in South Dakota, their governor is banned from gaining access to all 9 of the native held lands there in South Dakota. So, in response to this policy, the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, began a voluntary urban relocation program. Voluntary. That's, you know what? That's not how it played out. And again, I am looking at National Archives at archives.gov. So what really happened? Well, they were fed false promises that if you go to the city, life's going to be better. You're going to have more opportunities. Life is going to be grand. You're going to prosper. And they'd bust them in and dump them off. Hey, does that sound familiar? Are we seeing any of that today? Yeah, we'll give you a better life. Well, in this case right here, with the ones who figured out that this American Indian urban relocation program was not everything that it was cracked up to be. And just like a lot of the immigrants today that are in a lot of American cities are realizing, hey, these were empty promises. I want to go home. Well, it led to the formation of the American Indian Movement, which was officially founded in 1968 by Russell Means, Dennis Banks, and other leaders as a militant political and civil rights organization. And I can get into them deeper in another video. I have a certain level of admiration for these guys, and it goes way back. But this led to an event known as Wounded Knee 2, or the Second Wounded Knee Occupation in 1973, which led to a standoff between Ogallala Sioux at Wounded Knee and on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and led to a shootout with federal government, U.S. federal government. Actual armed conflict with U.S. military and federal law enforcement. You can see right here, Leonard Peltier remains in prison, although efforts to win him pardoned continue. Well, quick update. Today is July 8th, 2024, so this article is 6 days old, July 2nd, 2024. Indigenous activist Leonard Peltier denied parole for 1975 killings of 2 FBI agents, and evidence has exonerated him. Okay, evidence has exonerated him. But as we saw with the Julian Assange story, the federal government doesn't like being embarrassed. But neither do conspiracy theorists when their theosophical ties and their factual yet distorted take on history, because they don't actually take the time to look at it and study it, and they throw so much information at you that you just can't absorb it all at once. Confusion, it's a fantastic mind control device. If you run into it, you should probably walk away from the source of it. At least that's my advice. It may work for you. I hope it does. It's worked well for me in the past. Along with two more things. Well, yeah. Let me say this first. If you've made it this far into the video, I greatly appreciate it. I hope that you've learned something. I hope that you've been able to untangle any confusion you may have been experiencing. And if you haven't subscribed, I hope that you will. Or give a thumbs up. Share this with somebody. And if you want, yeah, definitely, I'm okay with folks using or referencing my materials. Not a problem. That said, if you have made it this far, you're a trooper. And I have two more pieces of advice for you. Stay hydrated, and mental health matters. Consider your sources carefully.
Everybody wants to